The fluorescent light above the hospital bed buzzed with a thin, tired hum, the kind of sound that never really goes away once you notice it. Elijah Carter lay against the raised mattress, one eye swollen shut, his ribs wrapped so tight that every breath felt like it had to be earned. A heart monitor traced its quiet rhythm beside him, the only steady thing in a room that suddenly felt very small. Officer Brett Haskins stood over him, still in uniform, his shadow falling across the blanket like something deliberate. In the corner, a man in a plain gray sweater sat reading a paperback, wire-framed glasses catching the light every time he turned a page. He had arrived that morning for a scheduled, protected interview, part of a preliminary federal review already open on Officer Haskins after 3 earlier community complaints. Elijah's attorney had requested it the night before, from the emergency room, hours after the assault. Haskins wasn't supposed to be there. He'd come on his own, unannounced, before the interview could even begin. Elijah had already agreed, in writing, to let the visit be recorded under the state's one-party consent law. The man in the sweater simply hadn't expected to need it quite this soon. "You're going to remember it my way," Haskins said, his voice low enough to stay between the two of them, but hard enough to leave bruises of its own. "The report already says you resisted. It already says you reached for me. All you have to do is nod along when they ask." Elijah's throat was dry. He forced the words out anyway. "I didn't reach for anything. I had my hands on the wheel the whole time." Haskins leaned in closer, close enough that Elijah could smell the coffee on his breath. "That youth center of yours. 20 kids a day, isn't it?" "Maybe 30. Places like that always have something an officer can find, if he looks long enough. One phone call is all it takes to change what people start looking for." Elijah's jaw tightened, but fear moved through his chest faster than anger could catch up to it. "Those kids have nothing to do with this." "They will," Haskins said, "if you keep telling people I'm the one who did something wrong." In the corner, the man in the sweater turned another page, but his eyes had stopped moving across the text several sentences ago. His phone sat face up on his knee, screen dark, recording light quietly on, exactly as the consent form had authorized. Haskins finally glanced toward him, as if noticing a chair had been occupied the whole time. "Who's this? Your lawyer?" "Just a visitor," the man said pleasantly without looking up. "Waiting on a friend." Haskins studied him for a second, decided he didn't matter, and turned back to the bed. "Think about what I said, Elijah. I'll come back later, and you're going to have the right answer for me." He straightened his jacket and walked out, his boots striking the tile in a rhythm that sounded like a man who had never once doubted he'd get away with it. The door swung shut behind him. For a moment, the only sound left was the monitor, counting out Elijah's heartbeat like it was keeping score. He had just threatened a beaten man's life's work, in a hospital room, in front of a witness he'd dismissed without a second thought. He had no idea the recording was lawful, authorized, and already being logged. The night before had started ordinary enough. Elijah had locked up the East Haven Youth Center a little after 9, same as always, the gym lights clicking off one bank at a time, the smell of rubber sneakers and floor wax still hanging in the hallway. He'd spent 22 years building that place out of a leaky rec room, with 2 basketball hoops into something the whole neighborhood leaned on. Tutoring after school, hot meals on Fridays, job interview coaching for teenagers who'd never worn a tie in their lives. He was driving home, radio low, mind already halfway into sleep, when the lights came on behind him, 2 blocks from his house. He pulled over immediately, hands where they belonged, the way he'd told 100 teenagers to do it themselves. Officer Haskins approached the window slow, flashlight first, and Elijah recognized him before he even spoke. The same officer who'd been at a community meeting 3 months earlier when Elijah stood up and asked, politely but firmly, why arrests in East Haven seemed to happen so much faster than de-escalation. Haskins hadn't forgotten that question. Later review of his patrol logs would show he'd run Elijah's plate less than a minute after passing him that night, then circled back. The stop itself was built on almost nothing, a taillight that a mechanic would confirm the next day had been working fine, and a rolling stop that dashcam footage, when it existed, never showed. Elijah answered every question calmly. He kept his hands visible. He said, "Yes, officer," more times than he could count. None of it mattered. Haskins pulled him out of the car with a grip meant to bruise, and what followed wasn't a struggle so much as a demonstration. A fist finding ribs, a shoulder slammed against the doorframe, a knee that never needed to be there. 4 minutes before he'd ever activated his lights, records would later show, Haskins had manually switched off both his body camera and his dashboard camera. Not a malfunction. A choice, logged in the system the moment it happened, waiting for someone to go looking. By the time backup arrived, Elijah was on the ground and Haskins was already rehearsing the story he'd tell. Subject became combative. Refused lawful commands. Officer used minimum necessary force to gain compliance. It read clean. It read routine. It read like 100 other reports nobody had ever bothered to question. Back in the hospital room, the door had barely settled shut when the man in the gray sweater finally set his book down. "Are you all right?" he asked, and something in his voice was steadier now, more deliberate than a stranger passing time in a waiting room should sound. Elijah exhaled, wincing at the effort it cost him. "He's going to come back." "I know," the man said. "We already suspected he might." By morning, Haskins was at his desk at the precinct, 2 fingers hunting across a keyboard, building his report the way a mason builds a wall, one careful, misleading brick at a time. Captain Warren Dale stopped by with a paper cup of coffee. "Internal Affairs got a complaint on the Carter stop," Dale said, not quite meeting his eyes. "This is the 3rd one on you this year. Make sure the paperwork's tight. City's touchy about press right now." "It's tight," Haskins said. "Carter's smart enough to know how this works." Dale nodded and walked away, more concerned with the department's numbers than with what the pattern of complaints on his own desk might actually mean. He had not helped falsify anything. He had simply chosen, 3 times, not to look closely enough to have to. Across town, in a windowless room built for work rather than comfort, Special Agent Maya Collins sat with her arms crossed, watching a laptop screen with the stillness of someone who had learned not to react on the first viewing. "Play it again," she said. Daniel Mercer, senior investigator with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Task Force, leaned forward and tapped the trackpad. Haskins's voice filled the room again, tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakable. "That youth center of yours. Places like that always have something an officer can find." "That's the beginning of an extortion case," Maya said quietly. "Not the whole thing, but the beginning." "There's more," said Noah Park, a digital forensics analyst with a laptop of his own and the restless energy of someone who'd been up most of the night. Body camera and dash camera both went dark 4 minutes before the stop even started. Manual shut-off, logged right there in the metadata. He turned his screen around. He didn't want a record, except this. Noah pulled up a second file, footage from a pharmacy security camera 2 doors down, footage that lived on a cloud server Haskins had never known existed. "That's angle 1, Noah said. "We're pulling 2 more, an apartment building across the street and a gas station a block up. Give us a day, and we'll have him from 3 directions. Hands raised, no resistance, start to finish." Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Sloan had been listening from the far end of the table. "What we have right now supports a strong civil rights case and likely extortion," she said. "What we don't have yet is a completed false statement in his own hand, or clear proof he intends to follow through on the threat against the youth center, rather than just intimidate. That gap matters if this goes to trial." "He already said he's coming back," Daniel said. "That's his decision, not ours. If he does, and if he brings a prepared statement or repeats the threat, that closes the gap on its own." Maya looked at him carefully. "And if Elijah doesn't want to be in the room for that?" "Then we arrest on what we have and build the rest through discovery," Rebecca said. "This only happens if he agrees with counsel present, medically cleared, and with the understanding that the case moves forward either way." They brought the plan to Elijah that afternoon, with his attorney beside the bed, and a hospital physician, confirming he was stable enough to be part of the conversation. Rebecca laid it out plainly. The evidence already collected was strong enough to arrest Haskins that day, if Elijah preferred. Agreeing to a second, monitored visit was entirely his choice, and refusing it would not weaken the case against Haskins in any way. If he threatens you again, or hands you anything to sign, that's the moment we move, Maya said. Not a second later. You'll have agents right outside that door, and a signal you can give at any point to end it immediately. Elijah sat with that for a long moment, his hands still shaking slightly against the blanket. He said those kids have nothing to do with this. He was wrong. I want to finish this the right way. Then we'll be right outside, Maya said. By early afternoon, the hospital had changed in ways nobody walking through the front doors would notice. 2 plainclothes agents sat in the visitors' lounge near Elijah's floor. A hospital security liaison, briefed and cooperating with the investigation, kept a quiet eye on the corridor. The floor's charge nurse had been informed and agreed to flag anything unusual. Daniel returned to Elijah's room a little after 2. Same sweater, same paperback, and pulled the visitor's chair back to where it had been that morning. You don't owe anyone another encounter with him, Daniel said. If you want this to stop right now, it stops. I know, Elijah said. I still want to see it through. Down in the parking garage, a patrol car pulled into a spot marked for emergency vehicles only. Haskins stepped out, badge clipped visibly to his belt, a folded document tucked under one arm, and walked through the hospital doors like he owned the tile beneath his boots. He reached Elijah's room, knocked once out of habit, and walked in without waiting for an answer. Daniel was in the same chair, same book, unremarkable as ever. Let's make this quick, Haskins said, pulling the folded document from his jacket and smoothing it flat on the rolling table. The statement, printed that morning from a precinct workstation logged under his own username, claimed Elijah had resisted, reached toward the officer, and caused Haskins's own minor injuries during what it called a lawful struggle. I'm not signing that, Elijah said. His voice shook slightly, but the words came out clear. I'm telling the truth, he added. Haskins's jaw tightened. You want to do this the hard way. One phone call, Elijah. A place can lose its funding a lot faster than you'd think, once the wrong kind of attention lands on it. Daniel closed his book and stood. That's enough, he said, and his voice carried across the room without ever rising. You've just handed a false statement to a man you assaulted and repeated a threat against a children's program to keep him quiet. That's on the record now. Haskins turned, genuinely startled. Who exactly do you think you are? Someone who's been listening since this morning, Daniel said, and reached for his phone. He didn't wait for Haskins to answer. He sent the signal. The door opened seconds later. Special Agent Maya Collins stepped inside first, badge raised, voice even and absolute. Officer Haskins, step away from Mr. Carter, hands where I can see them. 2 more agents filled the doorway behind her. Haskins's hand drifted toward his belt, an old reflex, and froze there. This is a local hospital. I'm conducting a lawful interview. You're under arrest for a civil rights violation, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering, Maya said. There will be more charges. That's what today gets you. My union will have a lawyer down here in 20 minutes. They can meet you at the field office, Rebecca said, stepping in behind Maya. We already have the recording. The camera shut down metadata. And now this statement in your handwriting. It's not going to be enough. For a long moment, Haskins looked at Elijah, still wrapped and bruised in that hospital bed, and something in his expression flickered. The first real crack of a man realizing the story he'd been telling himself for years was no longer the only one in the room. He grabbed the bed rail, some reflexive instinct to plant himself. The agents moved in without a hint of unnecessary force, one hand guiding his arm, another steady at his shoulder, the cuffs closing with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than anything else in the room. As they turned him toward the door, he looked back once, first at Elijah, then at Daniel. Daniel didn't gloat. Authority without accountability isn't power, he said. It's just intimidation wearing a badge. They walked Haskins out through the hallway in full view of nurses, doctors, and visitors who paused mid-conversation to watch a man in uniform escorted out in handcuffs. When the door finally clicked shut, the room felt strange in its stillness. Elijah's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the blanket, trying to steady them. "Is the center safe?" he asked, and the question came out smaller than he meant it to. "There was never a real search planned," Rebecca said. "It was a threat built on nothing, and now it's on record as exactly that. We'll be watching for any retaliation against the center regardless." Elijah nodded slowly, but his eyes were wet. "I kept thinking no one would believe me over a police officer," he admitted. "That was always his real weapon," Daniel said. "Not the badge, the idea that you were alone with it." By the next morning, the case had already reached local news, and then further than East Haven had expected. The Department of Justice announced charges against Officer Brett Haskins, covering the assault, the disabled recording equipment, the false report, and the hospital room witness tampering, with additional charges expected as the investigation continued. Two of the earlier complainants, whose cases had gone quiet years before, agreed to speak with investigators again, now that their accounts fit a pattern that could finally be laid out in full. Captain Warren Dale was placed on administrative leave while the department reviewed how 3 prior complaints against the same officer had each been closed without meaningful follow-up. Investigators made clear early on that the review was examining negligence in supervision, not a conspiracy, unless further evidence said otherwise. Officials were careful, in every public statement, to note that this was about one officer's pattern and the oversight failures that allowed it, not an indictment of the department as a whole. Several weeks passed. The bruises on Elijah's face faded first, then the ones along his ribs, until only a thin, pale scar remained near his collarbone. The East Haven Youth Center kept running the whole time. A handful of longtime supporters, businesses that had quietly given for years, organized a fundraiser once the story became public, and used it to finally replace a gym floor that had needed fixing for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Elijah would have preferred none of it happen this way. But the doors stayed open, and that was the part that mattered most to him. On a bright afternoon, with sneakers squeaking against fresh hardwood, Elijah noticed a familiar gray sweater near the doorway. Daniel stood there with a paper cup of coffee. "Didn't expect to see you again?" Elijah said, walking over. "I was in the area," Daniel said. "Prosecutors think he might take a plea. Long sentence either way." "The court will decide the number," Daniel said. "What matters is he already lost the one thing that protected him, the idea that no one worth worrying about was listening." Elijah looked out at the gym, at the kids running drills. "I used to think people like me didn't have much power in something like this." "You had more than you knew," Daniel said. "You just needed someone in the room when it counted." He finished his coffee, gave Elijah a small nod, and turned toward the door, an ordinary man in a plain sweater that nobody watching would remember by name. Truth, it turns out, doesn't need to announce itself. Sometimes it simply sits quietly in the corner of a room, waits for arrogance to talk, and stays until the evidence is finally, completely whole. If an officer is accused of serious force against a civilian, should that officer be barred from any further contact with the injured person except through counsel or an independent investigator? Share your answer in the comments.